after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, the United States carried out a mission to hunt down and destroy terrorist organizations. Since then, the U.S. presence in the African continent has increased, mainly conducting raids, finding, and killing Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda terrorist organization. Since 2002, the United States has supported cooperation with African countries such as Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, Chad, Niger, and Mauritania, but only a counter-terrorism cooperation without promoting bilateral economic cooperation, not enhancing cooperation on trade. The U.S. and the West have tended to abandon Africa, seeing the region as a land of problems rather than opportunities, with constant political turmoil. Therefore, the approach to Africa is quite slow compared to China and Russia. The U.S. concern now is that rising adversaries such as Russia and China pose a greater threat to security and sovereignty in Europe than an impoverished and unstable Africa. Beginning in 2018, the Department of Defense stated that strategic competition among nations, not terrorism, is now a primary concern for the national security of the United States, competing with so-called great powers, or peer competitors. China and Russia in particular have become the new U.S. priority, not the threats posed by al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. The U.S. only focuses on hotspots with Russia and China in Europe. That's not wrong, but the United States has too much disregard for Africa that allows Russia and China to exploit the gaps the United States has created. In 2007, the United States established the Africa Command, but strangely, the headquarters was in Germany, very, very far from Africa. This also shows that the U.S. is not really paying attention to Africa. The United States under President Trump only focused on trade war with China, refused to participate in all African conferences, even threatened to cut humanitarian aid to Africa. In July 2017, President Donald Trump left a working session on Africa at the G20 summit in Hamburg. In April, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson invited African Union Chief Moussa Faki to Washington, but then pulled out of the meeting at the last minute. President Trump also offends African countries with his disrespectful remarks. January 10, 2018 in Washington, during a press conference with Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg in the East Room of the White House, President Donald Trump referred to African countries, Haiti and El Salvador, as shithole. Trade between the United States and African countries has actually fallen from $160 billion in 2008 to about $64 billion in 2021. Meanwhile, in 2021, China has surpassed the U.S. as Africa's largest two-way trading partner with $254 billion, 4 times higher than the U.S. and Africa trade. While the United States ignores and despises Africa, China tries to get closer to Africa. In the international context, there is a debate about China's debt trap for African countries. China canceled 23 interest-free loans from 17 African countries. Although it is only a small amount of money, this move shows that China is pleasing African countries. In fact, more than 2 decades ago, the U.S. and the West were estranged from Africa. In the early 2000s, many African countries turned to China because they did not receive investment from the West and the World Bank. China comes in and provides support packages to build infrastructure. So far, $160 billion is the amount that African countries owe to China. Many times, China has generously canceled debt for African countries. Between 2019 and 2000, China canceled at least $3.4 billion of such debt in Africa for 31 countries. Countries in Africa prefer to cooperate with China than with the U.S. because when cooperating with China, African countries can export goods to China, accessing a market of 1.4 billion people. It is possible to buy weapons from China and can borrow from China. Without being bound by conditions such as democracy, human rights, the rule of law as required by the U.S. and the West. From 2019 to 2020, when China persecuted people in Hong Kong, 53 African countries have issued a statement supporting China's crackdown in Hong Kong. This shows that Africa is really leaning towards China. In fact, these claims are dependent on debts from China. Also around this time, America's biggest rival and biggest enemy for nearly 70 years is Russia, a presence in Africa. For about 2 decades, the fight against terrorism in Africa was not effective. The United States has shown fatigue without bringing any economic benefits. The gradual withdrawal of French and U.S. troops from Africa has left a security vacuum for Russia to exploit. In 2015 and 2017, the Wagner Force, a virtual army of Putin, began to be known when it appeared in Libya and Sudan. In fact, in 2005, Russia is the only country that supplies weapons to the dictator Omar al-Bashir regime in Sudan. Gradually, Wagner's activities appeared in dozens of countries in Africa to conduct military operations, provide military support packages such as training troops, supplying weapons, and even directly participating in military action if hired. In return, Russia is given access to valuable resources. Russia has also built the first naval base in the port of Port Sudan, making the U.S. hot face. The two rivals of the United States in the military and economic fields are Russia and China, respectively. Dominating most of the African continent, the United States really realized the danger when the enemy was getting closer and closer to the U.S. territory. If Russia and China shake hands, all of Africa will belong to the enemy of the United States. Both Russia and China have military bases in Africa and also possess ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. This is an alarm bell that threatens American security. The United States, under President Biden, is correcting its mistakes belatedly, but it is much needed. The United States is rapidly accelerating its cooperation with Africa when it is later than Russia and China. December 13 to 15, 2022, at the second U.S. Africa Leaders Summit held in Washington, the U.S. pledged $55 billion in aid to Africa over the next 3 years with cooperation in many fields. At the beginning of 2023, a series of high-ranking American figures kept coming to Africa. America wants to use speed to speed up Africa relations. In response to this move, President Putin wrote off debts of up to $20 billion to African countries. America's war for Africa with Russia, China is becoming hotter than ever. In the battle for influence in Africa, policy experts say the United States is the loser. However, the United States is determined to conquer Africa again. The video comes to an end. Goodbye and see you again.